Carl Jung explained you've been doing too much. Here's what happens when you stop. What if I told you that the reason your life feels stuck isn't because you're not doing enough, but because you're doing too much? Carl Jung believed the soul speaks not through action, but through stillness. And sometimes, the greatest breakthrough happens the moment you stop chasing, stop fixing, stop forcing, and just be. In this video, we'll explore why doing nothing isn't failure. It's alignment, and how surrendering control might be the most powerful thing you'll ever do. Don't skip this, because what comes next might change the way you live forever. Part 1. The paradox of doing nothing. Why surrender is powerful. It sounds absurd, right? Do nothing and everything will fall into place. In a world obsessed with constant hustle, achievement, and optimization, that kind of statement feels like spiritual laziness at best, and outright delusion at worst. But Carl Jung would ask, who is the one trying to control it all? Is it your true self or your ego? In Jungian psychology, this paradox is not only valid, but essential. The conscious ego, that part of us always striving, planning, and manipulating, believes it must do more to fix problems. Yet ironically, the more we try to force life to bend to our expectations, the more tangled we become in anxiety, resistance, and disillusionment. Jung observed that often. The deepest psychological transformations occur not when we act, but when we stop interfering. Doing nothing doesn't mean complacency. It means surrender. And surrender is not passive. It is a deliberate inner movement where the ego relinquishes its obsessive grip on control and allows the deeper forces of the unconscious to guide the process. Jung believed that life is a dialogue between the ego and the unconscious. But when the ego monopolizes the conversation, the unconscious is silenced, and with it, your deepest instincts, insights, and intuitive wisdom. Let's explore this in context. Imagine someone trying to find love. They chase, they text obsessively, they analyze every word from a date. Nothing seems to work. Why? Because they are approaching life from a place of control and fear, not alignment and wholeness. Jung would say, let go, sit with the discomfort, let the unconscious recalibrate your desires, your wounds, and your projections. Let the psyche breathe. This is the power of wu-wei, a concept Jung admired in Taoist philosophy, translated loosely as non-action or effortless doing. It's not about doing nothing out of laziness, but about letting go of forced effort and trusting the natural unfolding of things. The Tao does not push the river, it flows with it. Jung once remarked, all true things change, and only that which changes remains true. When you stop trying to micromanage your life, something profound happens. Your life begins to align not with your will, but with your truth. That's the subtle, powerful shift that no external effort can manufacture. And perhaps the greatest paradox is this: when you finally allow yourself to not do, the very thing you've been longing for begins to emerge. Not because you forced it into place, but because you got out of the way. Part 2. Ego versus self. Why forcing life backfires. In the architecture of Carl Jung's depth psychology, few dynamics are as central and as misunderstood as the relationship between the ego and the self. The ego is not the enemy. It's the part of your psyche that allows you to navigate the external world, your name, your role, your preferences, your story. But the self, capital S, is the totality of who you are. It includes not only the conscious ego, but also the unconscious mind, the shadow, your inner archetypes, and the divine imprint of your individuality. And it is from the self that true transformation, direction, and meaning emerge. Jung asserted that most of our suffering stems not from the circumstances of life, but from the ego's relentless attempt to override the self. It wants control, certainty, resolution. It fears the unknown and avoids stillness, because in stillness, the ego is no longer the center of attention. But here's the crux of the issue when the ego tries to force outcomes, whether it's through overthinking, obsessing, pushing, or manipulating, that ends up clashing with the natural rhythm of the psyche and the universe. This internal resistance creates psychological friction, And that friction manifests as anxiety, burnout, misalignment, and despair, in Jungian terms. This is the root of neurosis when the ego becomes alienated from the self. Let's look at it from a real-world psychological lens. A person feels they need to succeed quickly. Maybe they push their career goals obsessively. They set timelines, obsess over productivity, and benchmark themselves against others. On the surface, they're doing all the right things, but inside, they're spiritually suffocating. They're working against the grain of their deeper self, which might be calling them to slow down, to learn patience, or to listen to a completely different purpose altogether. But the ego doesn't care. It wants validation. It wants certainty. Jung would say this person isn't in tune with the self. They are stuck in the illusion of control, the belief that if they just do more, they'll finally arrive. But arrival never comes because they're climbing the wrong mountain. This is why Jung was adamant about the individuation process, the lifelong journey of aligning the ego with the self. Individuation isn't about achieving success in the way society defines it. It's about integrating all parts of the psyche into a harmonious whole. And sometimes, the most powerful step in that journey is to stop trying to force life into a shape it's not meant to take. When we release the ego's compulsion to make it happen, we start to perceive subtle cues from the unconscious. These could come in dreams, gut feelings, recurring symbols, or strange coincidences, what Jung called synchronicities. But we can only hear those signals when we've quieted the internal noise. As long as the ego dominates the conversation, the self cannot speak. Think of it like this: if you keep driving in the wrong direction with the GPS volume turned off, you'll miss every turn. The self is the GPS, but the ego is blasting music, ignoring the signs, thinking it knows better, and then it wonders why everything feels so off. This isn't just theoretical, it's deeply practical. Consider people in toxic relationships. The ego says, I can fix this. If I just try harder. If I love them more, they'll change. But the self knows better. The self whispers, you are abandoning yourself to rescue someone who doesn't want to be rescued. But if the ego doesn't listen, suffering ensues. And that suffering becomes a symptom of inner misalignment. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. He observed how clients often created more problems by refusing to stop obsessing, stop trying to control outcomes, stop avoiding silence. And once they began letting go, things began to shift, often in ways they couldn't have predicted. Jung once wrote, "We don't solve our problems, we outgrow them." That outgrowth begins when the ego no longer blocks the self from unfolding. Another important dimension is projection. When the ego is disconnected from the self, it often projects its internal conflict outward. For example, a person might be overly critical of others for being lazy, not realizing that deep down. They feel ashamed of their own exhaustion and need to rest. The act of doing nothing becomes threatening to the ego because it symbolizes weakness or failure. But the self may be crying out for rest, integration, and realignment. So instead of pausing, the ego doubles down, tries harder, and burns out even more. Jung warned about this loop. He believed that many modern people were suffering not because of their circumstances, but because they were refusing the internal call to stop and reflect. They were running from their unconscious, afraid of what they might find if they slowed down. But in doing so, they missed the opportunity for true healing. Because all genuine psychological transformation begins with awareness, and awareness requires stillness. This is where we see the real reason doing nothing works. It's not about apathy. It's about allowing the self to return to its rightful place as the inner compass. The ego must learn to bow not in submission, but in reverence. It must recognize its limits and trust the deeper intelligence at work within the psyche. There is also a spiritual component here. Jung was deeply influenced by Christian mysticism, Gnosticism, and Eastern philosophy. He saw surrender as a sacred act in the Christian tradition. Surrender is not giving up, it is giving over. It is saying, not my will, but thy will be done. In Eastern traditions, surrender is about flowing with the Tao, the natural order of things. Both perspectives point to the same truth when the ego steps aside. The soul steps forward. Psychologically, the experience of surrender often comes with discomfort. When people begin doing nothing, especially after a long period of compulsive action, they often feel guilt, fear, and even panic. This is the ego's protest. It says, if I'm not doing something, I'm worthless. I'll fall behind. I'll lose control. But these voices are illusions. They are remnants of a culture that equates action with value and stillness with failure. Jung believed that inner freedom begins when we dismantle these illusions, when we can sit in the silence, embrace the discomfort, and listen to what emerges. Then the true work begins. This is where healing takes root. This is where unconscious material surfaces and integrates. This is where we begin to remember who we are, not who the ego wants to be, but who the self has always been. Let's talk about one final angle: timing. The ego is obsessed with urgency. It wants results now, but the self operates on a different clock, and that is cyclical, symbolic, and non-linear. Just like nature doesn't bloom year-round, neither do we. Jung observed that many people became neurotic not because their lives lacked meaning, but because they demanded meaning appear on their own schedule. They were unwilling to wait, to trust, to allow life to unfold. Doing nothing then becomes a profound act of psychological and spiritual faith. It's saying, I trust the process. I trust that something deeper than my conscious mind is at work, and I won't interfere. This doesn't mean we never act. It means we act from alignment, not desperation. We speak when it's time to speak, move when it's time to move, love when the heart is open. We stop forcing, we stop chasing, and in that space, life begins to meet us halfway. That is why, in Jungian psychology, doing nothing isn't a retreat. It is a return to balance, to the self, and to the natural rhythm of your own becoming. Part 3, shadow work through stillness. What surfaces when you pause? When we stop acting, striving, and distracting ourselves, a strange thing begins to happen. The noise fades, and in the silence, the shadow emerges. Carl Jung believed that when a person chooses stillness, not out of avoidance, but out of conscious surrender, they enter a psychological threshold. It is in this threshold that what has been buried, denied, and repressed begins to rise. The shadow, according to Jung, is everything within us that we do not want to acknowledge. It includes our shame, fears, insecurities, compulsions, and even the traits we admire but have disowned. For many, the shadow is the unwanted sibling of the ego kept out of sight so we can maintain a socially acceptable self-image. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. It waits, it simmers, and the moment we stop doing, it sees an opening to speak. This is why, for some people, stillness feels unbearable. When the outer world no longer provides distraction, the inner world begins to surface. And it is rarely peaceful at first. The mind gets louder, the emotions become more intense, and long-suppressed memories or impulses may rise to consciousness. This is the terrain of the shadow, and it is not for the faint of heart. But Jung insisted this is precisely the work that leads to psychological wholeness. To illustrate, consider a common example: a person who cannot sit still. They are always working, cleaning, talking, or scrolling. The moment they stop, they feel a creeping anxiety. If they were to pause long enough, they might hear thoughts like, "You're not doing enough, you're lazy, you're falling behind." These voices often come from the inner critic, an internalized figure developed during childhood, often modeled on critical parents or authority figures. But beneath those thoughts lies something deeper: the fear of inadequacy, the shame of not being perfect, the sadness of being unseen. Jung would say, this is the beginning of shadow work. The discomfort is not a sign something is wrong, it's a sign something is ready to be integrated. Stillness exposes our psychological mechanisms. It reveals how much of our behavior is driven by unconscious forces. And more importantly, it creates the conditions necessary for integration. When we observe our shadow without judgment, we begin to reclaim the energy it holds. The very things we thought made us bad or broken often contain the seeds of our healing. Let's look at the archetypal significance of the shadow. In mythology, the shadow is often represented by dragons, monsters, or outcasts. They live in caves or forests, places we avoid, but these monsters often guard treasure. The story of the hero, again and again, is the story of someone who dares to face the beast within, and in doing so, they gain power, insight, and transformation. Jung understood that the monsters we fear most live within us, but he also knew that those monsters are not inherently evil. They are wounded, neglected, or misunderstood aspects of ourselves. They became monstrous because we refuse to love them. This is where stillness becomes a form of courage. To do nothing is to stop running. To stop running is to face what's been chasing you. And when you finally turn around, you realize that the shadow isn't there to destroy you, it's there to be healed. In therapeutic practice, this often looks like clients experiencing a breakthrough after a long period of resistance. They stop trying to fix themselves, and they start listening. In that quiet space, tears flow, memories return, emotions that had been frozen in time begin to thaw. This isn't regression, it's release, it's integration. And it can only happen when the psyche feels safe enough to lower its defenses. Let's take a deeper look at the emotions that arise during stillness. Common ones include restlessness, an urgent need to do something. This often masks anxiety or the fear of being alone with one's thoughts. Guilt, the belief that rest is unproductive or wrong. This stems from internalized cultural values that equate worth with work. Sadness, grief that has been pushed aside finally comes to the surface. Anger, unresolved frustration, often redirected inward and manifesting as depression. Fear, the fear of the unknown, or of what we might find if we look too closely. All of these emotions are invitations. They are not meant to be solved, but witnessed. Jung emphasized the power of observation. To witness your shadow without turning away is the first act of self-love. And love is what melts the defenses of the shadow. There's a metaphor often used in Jungian circles. The shadow is like a child locked in a basement. For years, this child has been crying, but no one came. So it learned to scream, to break things, to throw tantrums. When you finally open the door, you don't punish the child, you sit down beside it. You ask it why it's afraid. You hold its pain. And in that moment, the child calms down not because you demanded obedience, but because you offered connection. Stillness is the door. Many people resist this process because they've been taught that if they stop moving, they'll fall apart. And they're right in a way, something will fall apart. But it's not their soul. It's the false persona, the mask, the compulsive identities they have carried for survival. When those identities begin to crumble, people often say things like, I don't know who I am anymore. This is not a crisis, it's a rebirth. Jung called this the night sea journey, a descent into the unconscious, where the ego must confront its illusions. It is disorienting. It can feel like darkness, but it is a sacred passage, and it is always followed by renewal. Stillness allows for this descent. It creates the inner silence where the self can begin to reorganize the psyche from within. Old patterns lose their grip, new insights arise, and often, synchronicities appear, external confirmations that your inner world is shifting. Shadow work through stillness is not about self-improvement, it's about self-reclamation. You are not fixing yourself, you are retrieving lost parts of yourself. And each time you welcome back a piece of your shadow, you become more whole. This is why Jung warned against the danger of over-identifying with the ego's narrative. The ego wants clarity, structure, and answers. The shadow offers questions, case, and depth. But within that chaos lies the truth of who you are, not the polished version, but the full, complex, divine, and deeply human self. It is also important to note that the shadow is not only negative, it holds your passion, your creativity, your intuition, and your forgotten desires. Many people suppress their power because they fear what it might destroy. But when you embrace the shadow, your power becomes conscious. You can use it with integrity. This is why so many artists, mystics, and healers throughout history have honored solitude. They understood that stillness is the portal. not to escape the world, but to encounter the parts of themselves that hold the keys to transformation. Jung did not see the shadow as a burden, but as a gateway. And that gateway only opens when we stop trying to fix, improve, or perform and instead listen. Stillness is how we remember. Stillness is how we reconnect. Stillness is how the shadow comes home. Part 4. Synchronicity happens when you stop chasing. Carl Jung introduced the concept of synchronicity to describe meaningful coincidences that occur with no clear causal relationship, but with a deep psychological or spiritual significance. While traditional science looks for causes, Jung looked for meaning. And one of the most profound patterns he observed was this synchronicity often shows up when we stop chasing, stop forcing, and instead enter into alignment with the deeper rhythms of the psyche. To understand why synchronicity appears when we do nothing, we must first understand the psychological energy behind chasing. When we are chasing something, love, success, answers, control, we are usually doing so from the ego. The ego says, I must make this happen. I must grab it. If I don't act, I'll lose everything. This pursuit is often motivated by fear. Fear of being alone, fear of failure, fear of uncertainty. But Jung taught that the psyche is not moved by fear, it is moved by integration. When we are fragmented internally, our actions come from compensation. We try to fill inner holes with outer solutions. And as long as we're doing that, synchronicity doesn't appear because our energy is misaligned. We are acting against the self, not with it. But something strange begins to happen when we stop, when we surrender, when we say, I no longer need to force this. I trust that what is meant for me will find me. That shift, subtle but seismic, opens the door for the unconscious to move. And that is when synchronicity begins to emerge. Jung observed that synchronistic events are often most noticeable during key psychological transitions: falling in love, suffering loss, undergoing spiritual awakenings, or entering therapy. In all of these moments, the ego loosens its grip and the unconscious is activated. Symbols appear in dreams. People show up out of nowhere. A book falls off a shelf and changes your entire perspective. You think of someone and they call. These events are not random. They are signals. But here's the paradox: you can't make synchronicity happen. You can only make space for it. And that space is created by not chasing, by releasing the compulsive need to control. Synchronicity flows into the vacuum that opens when the ego steps aside. To go deeper, Jung believed that synchronicity reveals the underlying unity of the psyche and the cosmos. What you experience internally is reflected externally, not in a linear way, but in a symbolic, poetic, even mystical way. This is not magical thinking. It is archetypal thinking. The psyche doesn't speak in logic, it speaks in symbols. And synchronicity is how the universe speaks in that same symbolic language back to you. Consider a story Jung often shared. A woman was recounting a dream in which she was given a golden scarab. As she told the dream, Jung heard a tapping on the window. He opened it and a large scarab-eyed beetle, a close match to the golden scarab in the dream, flew in. This was a rare occurrence, especially in the region and season. Jung used this moment to break through the woman's psychological resistance. The scarab became a symbol of transformation, death, and rebirth. It marked a turning point in her therapy. Was it a coincidence? Perhaps, but it was meaningful, and that meaning made it real. This is synchronicity, the external world mirroring the internal state with exquisite timing. Now let's explore why it happens only when we stop chasing. Chasing is rooted in scarcity. It tells the universe, I don't trust you, I need to push. But when you act from trust, from presence, from alignment, you enter into the natural flow of life. Jung believed that when a person is individuating, becoming their whole self, the outer world begins to reflect their inner transformation. Opportunities, people, signs, and symbols emerge not by accident, but as part of a deeper pattern. This is why doing nothing is not an action, it is alignment. You are no longer resisting the flow, you are open. And when you're open, you notice what's always been there, but overlooked in the noise. People often misunderstand synchronicity as something mystical and rare, but Jung saw it as part of the psyche's natural language. The reason we don't see it more often is because we're too distracted. When the ego is obsessed with chasing, it filters out anything that doesn't fit its agenda. The unconscious, on the other hand, is always communicating, but it requires stillness, curiosity, and humility to listen. Let's ground this in a modern example. Imagine someone obsessively trying to find a life partner. They're on dating apps, texting multiple people, constantly evaluating, analyzing, and feeling frustrated. Nothing seems to stick. Then, exhausted, they stop. They delete the apps. They take time to reflect, to go inward. Maybe they begin therapy. Maybe they start journaling or traveling alone. And then, unexpectedly, they meet someone in a bookstore or a park or at a friend's gathering. The person who shows up reflects the deeper work they've done, not the ego's fantasy, but the self's desire. That's synchronicity. Jung would argue this encounter was not chance, it was the external world responding to the internal shift. But it could only happen because the chasing stopped. The chasing was a distraction. The surrender created alignment. There is another layer, the connection between synchronicity and purpose. Jung believed that synchronicities often guide us toward our unique path. When we ignore our inner voice, life becomes chaotic. But when we listen, even passively, through stillness, the path reveals itself. Synchronicities are like cosmic breadcrumbs. They don't give you the whole map, but they light the next step. But here's what most people miss. Synchronicity is interactive. It responds to your inner state. If you're anxious, closed, and controlling, the world reflects confusion. If you're grounded, open, and surrendered, the world reflects coherence. This is why so many mystics and healers emphasize non-attachment, because attachment distorts perception. You begin seeing only what your ego wants to see, but non-attachment clears the lens. And in that clarity, synchronicities become obvious, abundant, and often life-changing. There is no formula, no trick, no strategy. You don't manifest synchronicity by thinking positively. You allow it by getting out of your own way. Jung would say, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Synchronicity is what happens when you start to recognize that hidden direction. One of Jung's patients once described how, after years of struggling with grief, she sat in a park doing absolutely nothing. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel without resisting. At that moment, a child ran past her, laughing and pointing at a bird in the sky. Something clicked in her. She felt joy, not because of the child or the bird, but because she was present enough to receive it. That experience became a turning point in her healing. The world was speaking, and this time, she could hear it. That is the power of not chasing. Synchronicity does not operate on our timelines. It shows up when the conditions are right psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and those conditions are usually created by surrender. Doing nothing isn't lazy, it's receptive. It's feminine in the archetypal sense, open, intuitive, magnetic. When we stop chasing, we become receptive to the language of the soul, and the soul speaks through synchronicity. So if you're not seeing signs, if life feels random or stuck, ask yourself, where am I still chasing? Where am I trying to control? Where have I not allowed the self to speak? Often, the answer is not more effort, it's less. The self already knows what you need. The universe is already orchestrating your path. Your only job is to align, to listen, and to stop getting in the way. And in that sacred stillness, life begins to respond not with force, but with flow. Part 5, Trusting the Unconscious, Letting the Soul Speak. Carl Jung spent his life exploring the unconscious not as a dark, chaotic realm to be feared, but as a vast inner world rich with meaning, direction, and untapped potential. To Jung, the unconscious wasn't just a storage room for suppressed thoughts. It was the wellspring of the soul, the birthplace of insight, creativity, healing, and destiny. And yet, the modern ego doesn't trust it. What? Because it can't control it. This mistrust is why people overthink, overanalyze, and overact. They don't believe there's any intelligence beyond their conscious mind. They assume if they don't fix it, guide it, plan it, then nothing will happen. But Jung disagreed entirely. He believed that the psyche, when left undisturbed, knows how to heal, reorganize, and guide itself. Doing nothing, in this sense, becomes a radical act of trust. It says, I trust that my unconscious knows something I don't. I trust that there's a wisdom deeper than my thoughts. The unconscious speaks in images, symbols, dreams, synchronicities, gut feelings, sudden shifts in emotion, and even physical sensations. It never sends emails or step-by-step instructions. It nudges, it stirs, it whispers. But if we are too busy chasing external validation, if our minds are full of noise, we miss the whisper. Jung often pointed to dreams as the primary language of the unconscious. He didn't see dreams as meaningless brain static, but as the psyche's attempt to communicate what the conscious ego ignores. A dream is like a private film made by your soul, loaded with symbols tailored to your personal journey. But to hear that message, you must first stop imposing your own. When people do nothing, truly nothing, not scrolling or distracting, but sitting with presence, they enter the space where the unconscious can finally speak. This is why solitude, silence, and stillness are so powerful. They're not about zoning out, they're about tuning in. They create the internal silence needed for the soul to speak clearly. Trusting the unconscious requires a major psychological shift. Most people are trained from childhood to rely only on what is visible, logical, and measurable. Anything irrational or emotional is labeled as weak, dangerous, or indulgent. But Jung flipped that paradigm. He argued that the irrational often holds the key to integration. Think of a person struggling with burnout. They go to doctors, change jobs, take vacations, but the fatigue lingers. Nothing seems to work. Then one night they have a dream they're trapped in a burning building. No one comes to help. They wake up crying. That dream is not random. It's their unconscious screaming. You are not safe where you are. You are abandoning yourself, but if they don't slow down, if they don't sit in stillness, that message remains buried. They will keep burning. The unconscious is not out to sabotage you. It wants to help, but it will not compete with the noise of your surface-level distractions. It will wait until you are quiet, and often, that quiet comes in the form of doing nothing. This is also where intuition enters the conversation. Intuition is the conscious mind's interface with the unconscious. It's that feeling you get when something just doesn't feel right, or when you know what to do without knowing why. Most people dismiss their intuition because it lacks hard evidence. But Jung saw intuition as one of the 4 primary psychological functions alongside thinking, feeling, and sensation. And for those on the path of individuation, learning to trust your intuition is essential. But again, you can't hear your intuition if you're constantly bombarded by your ego's agendas. The ego wants outcomes. The unconscious wants truth. When the two are at odds, the ego tends to win temporarily, but the body keeps score. The soul grows restless. And eventually, something breaks a relationship, a career, a worldview. That break is not failure, it's feedback. The unconscious is demanding to be heard. So how do we trust something we can't see? By observing its patterns, Jung recommended keeping a dream journal, noticing repeated symbols in your life, paying attention to what triggers you, what energizes you, and what draws you in without explanation. These are clues. The unconscious is like a wild animal. It won't come out if it senses judgment, but if you wait patiently, it will show you what it wants you to know. Doing nothing becomes the bait. It says, I am no longer here to control or manipulate. I am here to listen. One of the most difficult aspects of trusting the unconscious is that it rarely gives you the answers you want. It gives you the answers you need. You may want a sign that says, take this job or marry this person. Instead, you get a dream of drowning. That's the unconscious telling you you're overwhelmed, disconnected, or in need of rebirth. The message is symbolic, not literal. but it's always honest. Jung saw the unconscious as morally neutral, but deeply oriented toward wholeness. That means it will surface both your light and your darkness. You might receive a dream that shows your capacity for love, or one that confronts you with your cruelty. Either way, the goal is integration. You cannot become whole by rejecting parts of yourself. You must invite all of it to the table, though. Stillness then becomes sacred. It's where the inner dialogue begins. Not the ego's monologue, but a real dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious mind. In this dialogue, something new is born: wisdom. Not the kind you read in books, but the kind that arises from within, that feels ancient, embodied, and real. People often say, "I don't know what to do with my life." But what they really mean is, "I haven't listened long enough." The answers are within, but they require patience. They require not jumping to the next task, the next achievement, the next dopamine hit. They require space. When we create that space by doing nothing, we make room for the unconscious to breathe. And when it breathes, it guides, it reorganizes, it harmonizes. Life begins to make sense again, not because you figured it out, but because you stopped getting in the way. Jung's patients who surrendered to this process often reported breakthroughs that felt like miracles. A man plagued by anxiety dreams stops resisting them and begins interpreting them and finds the root in childhood trauma. A woman grieving loss stops trying to suppress it and lets herself weep and discovers an untapped well of creative expression. These are not flukes. They are the result of listening to the soul. Jung once said, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart." Who looks outside? Dreams. Who looks inside? Awakens. This awakening does not require you to act. It requires you to attend to be present with your inner world as it is, not as you wish it to be. In the modern world, where productivity is worshipped and silence is rare, doing nothing can feel like rebellion. And it is. It's a rebellion against the ego's dictatorship. It's a return to inner democracy, where every part of you, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, has a voice. Trusting the unconscious means surrendering the illusion of control. It means stepping into mystery, into symbols, into non-linear time. It means letting go of the idea that healing and direction come from effort. They come from alignment. And alignment begins the moment you sit still, do nothing, and say, "Speak, I'm listening." Part 6, Transformation Through Patience. Why Things Fall into Place. In Carl Jung's view, transformation doesn't arrive with the force of a storm. It unfolds like the slow thaw of winter into spring, the modern psyche. However, is not built for waiting. It is conditioned to crave immediacy, fast results, instant healing, quick fixes. But Jung understood that anything truly meaningful, anything rooted in the soul, requires time, deep, non-linear, unpredictable time. That's why the act of doing nothing isn't just about surrender. It's about patience. And patience, paradoxically, is what creates the conditions for lasting transformation. Transformation through patience is not passive. It is alive. It is a quiet burning away of what no longer serves you. Jung compared the psyche's developmental process to that of alchemy, the transformation of lead into gold. But in alchemy, nothing happens quickly. It requires phases of dissolution, stagnation, fermentation, and coagulation. Each phase takes its own time. The alchemist doesn't rush the process, they trust it. So too must we trust the process of psychological growth. Let's explore how this patience-oriented transformation looks through Jung's lens. When a person reaches a breaking point, an existential crisis, a heartbreak, a burnout, the ego demands resolution. Fix this now. It says, make the pain stop. But the self, the deeper center of the psyche, knows that transformation cannot be scheduled. Instead, it calls the person into a liminal space, a space of in-between, where the old identity no longer fits, but the new one has not yet formed. This is the cocoon phase. And in this phase, doing nothing is not failure, it's sacred necessity. Jung described this space as the nigredo stage in alchemy, a dark night of the soul where the psyche disintegrates before it can be reassembled. During this phase, you may feel lost, directionless, emotionally raw. You might not even recognize yourself. That's normal, because you're shedding the false self. You are dissolving the mask. And in that dissolution, something real begins to take shape, but only if you have the patience to allow it. The danger in this stage is the temptation to escape it prematurely. People often try to bypass the discomfort with distractions, rebound relationships, spiritual bypassing, or impulsive decisions. But Jung warned that bypassing the process leads to spiritual inflation, a false sense of awakening that lacks integration. Real transformation cannot be faked. It must be endured. So how does doing nothing play a role in this? It forces you to stay, to sit in the discomfort long enough for the unconscious to work its way through. This isn't glamorous work. It's quiet, internal, often invisible to others. But beneath the surface, the psyche is reorganizing. Old patterns are loosening. New values are forming. Emotional wounds are being metabolized into wisdom. Consider the analogy to planting a seed. You don't dig it up every day to check on its progress. You trust that, beneath the soil, it is doing its work. The same is true of the psyche. When we stop interfering, stop overthinking, overreacting, overplanning, we give the unconscious space to germinate. Eventually, new insights break through the surface, seemingly out of nowhere, but they've been growing the whole time. This is why Jung valued the therapeutic process not for its speed, but for its depth. He often worked with clients over many years, slowly helping them make sense of their dreams, projections, and emotional cycles. He believed that transformation could not be rushed because the psyche is not a machine, it is a living ecosystem. And ecosystems evolve in cycles, not straight lines. Jung also warned that when people push too hard for change, they often create the opposite effect: repression, denial, and fragmentation. The ego may try to get better, but if the unconscious isn't ready, the attempt backfires. That's why so many self-help strategies fail. They operate on the assumption that you can will your way to healing. But Jung's model says otherwise. Healing happens when you stop resisting what is and begin listening to what wants to become. This is where patience becomes a portal. Patience is the willingness to remain in the unknown without forcing clarity. It's the ability to sit with contradiction, to feel confusion without demanding resolution. It's the inner posture that says, I trust the deeper rhythm of my life, even if I don't understand it yet. One of Jung's most revolutionary ideas was that psychological symptoms are not enemies to be eliminated, but messages to be decoded. Depression, anxiety, even apathy. These are the psyche's way of signaling that something is out of alignment. They are not interruptions to your life. They are your life asking for your attention. But to hear what they're really branding, you must stop trying to silence them. You must wait. You must observe. You must let the meaning unfold on its own timeline. People often resist this because they equate patience with helplessness. But Jung reframed patience as participation. You're not doing nothing, you're holding space. You're becoming a conscious witness to your own unfolding. And in doing so, you shift from being a victim of your experience to being a vessel for transformation. This shift is profound. When you become a vessel, you no longer see life as something happening to you, but as something happening through you. You begin to see your pain as initiation, your confusion as reorientation, your stillness as incubation. This is what it means to trust the self. You let it work in its own time. Let's bring this into practical context. Imagine someone who's just gone through a divorce. The ego wants to rebuild immediately: new partner, new apartment, new narrative. But the self may want solitude, grief, reflection. The person who resists this and rushes into a new relationship might repeat the same patterns because they haven't integrated the lessons. But the person who chooses stillness, who waits, who grieves consciously, that person undergoes true transformation. They don't just recover, they evolve. This is why Jung emphasized symbols and archetypes. Symbols bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the unconscious. They appear in dreams, fantasies, synchronicities, not to give answers, but to stir transformation. And again, They require time. A single dream symbol may take months or years to fully reveal its significance, but each layer peeled back adds depth, meaning, and alignment. The real miracle of transformation isn't that your circumstances change, it's that you change. You begin to see with different eyes. You move with different values. You relate to yourself, to others, and to life itself in a new way. That level of change cannot be manufactured. It must emerge, and emergence cannot be rushed. This is the great irony. Doing nothing is often the most transformative thing you can do. Because in the stillness, you stop forcing life to match your ego's blueprint, and you start allowing it to follow your soul's design. And your soul doesn't operate on deadlines. It operates on readiness. This is why Jung called individuation a slow and painful process. It's not sexy. It's not viral. It doesn't fit into a 5-step plan, but it is real, and it lasts because it is rooted not in performance, but in patience. So when you're in a phase of not knowing, not moving, not achieving, don't panic. Don't label it a failure. Consider that something deeper may be unfolding, and your only task is to stay with it, to stay conscious, to stay kind, to stay open. And eventually, you'll notice what once felt like chaos has become clarity. What once felt like loss has become liberation. What once felt like stillness was actually the space where your true self began to grow. Part 7, doing nothing as a sacred practice, the ultimate inner freedom. For most people, doing nothing is associated with laziness, weakness, or disengagement from life. But for Carl Jung, it was something radically different. In his view, doing nothing when approached with awareness and intention is not just psychologically transformative. It is spiritually sacred. It is the moment when the ego stops performing and the self begins expressing. It is when the human being steps aside and lets the soul speak, not in words, but in silence, in intuition, in still presence. This is not apathy, this is freedom. In a world addicted to motion and noise, the act of doing nothing becomes an inner rebellion, a refusal to let your worth be measured by output, speed, or constant engagement. Jung recognized that our modern obsession with doing was often a defense mechanism, a way to avoid the deeper truths that only emerge when we stop running. He wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. But when you do nothing, you are no longer avoiding, you are confronting your being." Jung saw inner freedom not as the absence of problems, but the ability to relate to life without being imprisoned by the ego's compulsions. The ego wants identity, it wants labels, achievements, goals, the self. By contrast, wants authenticity, it wants wholeness. And authenticity cannot be forced. It must be revealed, and revelation only happens in stillness. Think of the archetype of the monk, the mystic, the hermit, or the healer. These are not just spiritual personas, they are psychological symbols of the individual who withdraws from the world not to escape it, but to return to it with deeper clarity and power. Jung often worked with these archetypes in his analysis. He saw that in every individual, there is a deep yearning not to have more, but to be more, and to be more, you must first unlearn the noise. Doing nothing becomes a sacred practice because it unhooks you from the conditioned mind. You stop chasing desires that were never yours. You stop performing roles you never chose. You start dissolving the false selves, the masks, the projections, and what remains is presence pure, unadulterated awareness, the observer, the witness, the soul. This sacred nothingness is not a void, it is a fullness. It's the space where you realize that you are not your achievements, not your status, not even your story. You are the awareness in which all of those things rise and fall. And in that realization, there is a freedom unlike any other, the freedom of not needing to become anything, because you already are everything you need to be. Jung often drew from Eastern wisdom traditions, particularly Taoism and Hinduism, to explore this space of sacred stillness. In the Bhagavad Gita, the idea of actionless action is explored, a state where one acts without attachment to results. In Taoism, the concept of wu wei speaks of effortlessness, of doing through not doing. These ideas resonated with Jung's core insight that the deepest movements of the psyche are not initiated by the will, but by surrender. Consider this when you meditate, when you walk slowly in nature. When you sit in silence watching the clouds pass, there is no goal. Yet something shifts. You don't